Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com, a new podcast where we bring you news, insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Ronan Murphy and I'm delighted to be joined again this week by Duncan Castles, who is back with us on the show. Welcome back, Duncan.
Thanks, Ronan. It's good to be back with the Carlo Charmer, particularly after that impressive 5-man edition, setting new standards for the Transfers podcast a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, hopefully we did, and maybe it was our own Football Transfers 5-a-side team. I'm a bit of a centre back myself, it's good to be back with you this week anyway, so we can get into the meat and bones of the transfers that might happen in the future. Whereas last time we kind of rounded up what had been happening, and hopefully the listeners enjoyed it. But I know we have some big talking points on this week's podcast, and people will be delighted to hear that we'll be chatting Real Madrid, Man City, Arsenal, Chelsea, and of course the repeated car crash that's Manchester United. So I suppose we'll get started then with the big news that you have first, a potential world record transfer fee, which could have ramifications for Man City's rebuilding plan.
Yeah, it's interesting in the context of what we've been discussing towards the end of the transfer window, and obviously in that last podcast after the transfer window, that transfer fees in general and the amount of spending has been diminishing, and maybe this feeds into what Real Madrid are thinking here. That this is something that's been ongoing for several months now. It was actually in play at the end of the last transfer window, in that the Saudi Pro League have approached Vinicius Jr. To try and convince him to come and be the new face of the Saudi Pro League, a younger player at the peak of his career, essentially to replace Cristiano Ronaldo as the number one image of the Pro League. They have, of course, thrown huge amounts of money at the Brazilian. Proposed huge amounts of money as a salary package, understanding that it's reached as much as €1 billion of obviously post-tax salary for a 5-year deal. And Madrid, interestingly, not entirely opposed to that deal. The guidance I have is that Madrid still see that as a consideration, even though Vinicius said no in the summer window. They expect the Saudis to come back and try and convince the player to go. They know that the player isn't entirely happy with Spanish football for very well documented and well understood reasons, the repeated racism he suffers there. I think if you go back to one of the first podcasts in this season of the Transfers podcast, when we had Julio Gomez Filho on the programme, he flagged up that Vinicius wasn't entirely happy in Spain and said, look, there's a potential that he could end up moving elsewhere despite his importance to Madrid team and coming to kind of the peak of his career in the last season. So Real Madrid, it's not that they're actively trying to sell the player, it's just they know that in terms of securing a high transfer fee, nobody is going to be able to outbid the Saudi Pro League. They know these salary offers have been placed in front of the player and there's been a degree of interest from the player. If he accedes to that invitation, I'm told they're prepared to sell him if they can get a fee commensurate with the kind of salary that's being offered to Vinicius. And the trigger point that's been mentioned to me was a world record transfer fee. So exceeding the €222 million that Paris Saint-Germain paid for Neymar several seasons ago. Why does this have implications for Manchester City? Well, City were aware of what was going on with Vinicius at the end of the transfer window. They, of course, needed a striker and were looking to sign a striker because they'd sold Julian Alvarez to Atletico for a fee that it turned up being the highest of the summer transfer window, potentially rising to €95 million. And they saw Rodrigo at the Real Madrid's other main Brazilian striker, as kind of ideal replacement for Alvarez, and had started speaking to the player, started sounding out the possibility of a move. Rodrigo was positive towards City. City believed there was the possibility that they could convince the player to go, and also that they could come to a deal with Madrid, because Madrid obviously bringing Kylian Mbappe in and Endrick in the summer. It could have made sense for them to allow Rodrigo to leave for a big transfer fee. In the end, towards that final part of the window, Madrid told Rodrigo to wait. They wanted to see what was happening with Vinicius and to hold on and not agree to anything with Manchester City, because the possibility was there, live possibility at the time, that Vinicius could be sold, and then Rodrigo's place and significance in the team would be reinstated. As it turns out, neither deal happened, but Rodrigo remains the principal option, I think, for Manchester City to strengthen in attack if they see that Madrid will open the door for them to allow them to take the player. And of course, they've had encouragement from the player that he would be interested in moving to England.
Yeah, it would definitely be an interesting one to see who Man City will bring in, because we know they need to strengthen an attack, because they seem more than ever over-reliant on Erling Haaland, and when Erling Haaland doesn't get on the score sheet, then it looks like this Man City team is struggling to find goals elsewhere. And obviously part of that may be down to Kevin De Bruyne being out, or Phil Foden coming back from injury and things like that. But yeah, they definitely need more firepower in attack, and Alvarez was such a good option for Man City to have, to be able to rotate, to come off the bench. You knew he was capable of being a goal scorer, and Rodrigo could easily be that. But I suppose Real Madrid were right to tell him to wait, because they didn't know what was going to happen with the Vinicius moving. They obviously still don't know whether this is going to happen in the future, because with the money the Saudi Pro League have, and the fact that just this week Cristiano Ronaldo has kind of hinted at retirement for the first time, which we hadn't really heard him say. He always wanted to break records and seemed to play forever and play at every international competition, but he's been kind of hinting that he's coming towards the end of his career, which is going to really shake up the Saudi Pro League and how they will need to advertise themselves and promote themselves as the kind of league of the future. And Vinicius Jr. seems like the ideal player for that, because he could be the Ballon d'Or winner this year.
Yeah, look, I think with Cristiano Ronaldo, we've seen over the last few months growing irritation, various points of conflict, various acts on the field or around the field that have been embarrassing to the league. And he's there to promote the Saudi Pro League, and he's there to promote the country. So there's a tension there. If Cristiano Ronaldo's discontent with aspects of how Saudi football is organised and how his team are playing continues, then it does become problematic. I think you're right to identify the importance of Julian Alvarez to Manchester City. He obviously didn't start every game, but he got a lot of minutes for them, able to play a number of roles, able to score goals in different ways, able to work within that attack in a different fashion to Erling Haaland. And, I think if you compare the way Rodrigo plays to Julian Alvarez, you can see the similarities there. You can see that ability to run at opponents, play in tight spaces, pass the ball across the attacking line, receive and feed other players. Some of the elements are things that Haaland isn't as good at. Obviously, a superb player in many domains, but there are weaknesses in this game, and I think Alvarez was a good foil, a good alternative, and a good partner at times for Haaland. And to get themselves back to having that degree of attacking and strategic options, they do need to bring a new attacker in.
On the other side of Manchester, they're having problems of their own, obviously, because they're heading for a 150-year anniversary, and they wanted to be a momentous one. Omar Barada, the CEO, has been talking about Project 150, and he wants the club to be in a very good place. But at the moment, they don't necessarily look to be in a very good place. And Erik Ten Hag, he seems to be under a lot of pressure at the moment. How long can it continue, and is he being given the right support at the club?
The new Manchester United chief executive, who's been talking about this 150-year anniversary and kind of been identifying 2028 as the point at which Ineos, who appointed him, Jane Ratcliffe, Dave Brailsford, want the team to be, well, he talks about the ultimate target for Manchester United, and it's always going to be this, is that we should be challenging for the Premier League and challenging for the Champions League, because it's one of the biggest clubs in the world. You're right, and where they are at the moment is very far from that. I've watched the match at the weekend, and my feeling was that what they look like is what they are at the moment, which is a mid-table team, and a not very good mid-table team. You look at how they've started this season. Their current total is 7 points, is their joint fewest in the Premier League after 6 games. Only in one Premier League season have United scored fewer goals in the first 6 Premier League games. They lost consecutive home Premier League matches without scoring for the first time since November 2021. They played 9 games so far this season. The only teams they've beaten are Fulham, and not particularly convincingly, Southampton, who have just 1 Premier League point all season, and League One Barnsley. There's an array of stats, but two of the most telling ones that came out after the weekend game was the 2 players who've created the most chances at Old Trafford in the Premier League this season are Dejan Kulusevski and Andreas Pereira, and that Tottenham have created more XG to the extent which you have faith in expected goals at Old Trafford than Manchester United have all season. And it's not just statistically, it's when you see the way they're playing, there's no coherence to the team at all. The only time they look in any way convincing is on the counter-attack, and you saw Ange Postecoglou mentioning the main thing he was worried about was the Manchester United counter-attack, so he set up his game plan to prevent that. And playing with a deep block and using the fast strikers on the break, and that can't be the answer for Manchester United long term. Ironically, it's one of the reasons they've got themselves into this situation. We had a long discussion on the podcast in the summer when Erik Ten Hag was given his contract extension about how this was not what Ineos wanted to do. This was not the plan. They had come to the conclusion that they needed to change coach. They had started speaking to candidate coaches quite extensively. The idea was that Ten Hag would be dismissed at the end of the season, but then he wins the FA Cup against Manchester City. This rising support from the fans that he should stay because he's beaten Manchester City, using a very specific and a cleverly tailored tactic where they played without a striker, worked on the counter attack, and it worked for that match. You see him go into the start of the season. He was using the same formation against opponents which it wasn't fitted for, and the idea that you could play consistently in that formation at Manchester United, I think, is just impossible. So I think Ineos here have very much made a rod for their own back, in that they've committed to a manager that they didn't truly believe in. They've had to say that he was the best option for the job. We've seen Omar Barada and Dan Ashworth before the Liverpool 3-0 defeat saying that exactly that, but separating themselves from the decision, noting that neither of them were under the contractual employment of the club when Ten Hag was given that new contract, which I think is always a bad sign for a manager when the chief executive and the director of football want to put on record that it wasn't actually their decision to bring the coach in. The guidance from Manchester United, the off-record guidance from the moment, is that the club is very calm. that Ashworth and Barada don't want to get drawn into what they describe as an external sense of crisis. That the desire is to see the two parties succeed together. So the plan for it to work with Ten Hag, and that Ten Hag is committed to making it work. How long they can stick with that, I have serious question marks about, because I think that the fan support is gone. It's obvious that you don't have the level of performance on the field that we're looking for, and it's obvious that the players are not buying into this Ten Hag regime in the way they should be, given that the vast majority of the players were now signed under his managerial reign, and the majority of those specifically identified by him and requested as priority targets for those positions. You've got Benny McCarthy talking this week, Ten Hag's assistant for his first 2 seasons, but moved out of that role in the summer, talking this week about how some of the players, when he was working with them, did not train at the level that was expected of them. Said this ended up limiting United's progress because some players weren't training to the best of their ability, and even in games, the data showed us that some players were at their peak performance and others a little below. And McCarthy also, I think, interestingly highlighting that he thinks tactically Ten Hag is a top coach, but that he lacks a bit of fire and passion. And he thinks that the players wanted to see more passion in their coach. So all in all, I think it's a very problematic position, not just for Ten Hag to be in, but for Jim Ratcliffe, Dave Brailsford, Dan Ashworth, Omar Barada, Jason Wilcox to be in, because they have sunk a lot of their ability to operate into the transfer market, into players that Ten Hag wanted, and built a squad with the idea that it would be coached by Ten Hag. And now they're looking at having to bring another coach in before very long, because results just are not at a level that can be acceptable for what they're talking about wanting to achieve.
Yeah, it seems like his days are numbered, and you would expect Manchester United to pull the trigger sooner rather than later. And obviously, we've been hearing about international break is the time to change manager, and obviously you have a couple of weeks or a bit more time to bed in the new man. But yeah, it seems that his days are definitely numbered, and there's names being linked all over the shop, and people have been linked consistently, and then we are hearing various others linked to Man United, and obviously it's one of the biggest jobs in world football, so top managers are always going to be linked with it. But do you have any idea of where they might go if Ten Hag does get the bullet?
Look, I think they want to avoid doing this because they've sunk so much into it by giving him that contract extension. As we discussed in the summer, I think the logical path for them, if they felt they could not change because the right person wasn't available in the summer and because the supporters wanted to see Ten Hag retained, would have been just to keep the status quo, not to give him that contract extension, and to have the ability to say, well, we retained him because we didn't need to extend. We don't need to make this show of announcing that he has a new deal and handing over more power to him and allowing him to retain control of the transfers, and then we see how it goes. And if it doesn't go well, we change during the season. What they've done is tied their flag to Erik Ten Hag's flag to a certain extent, and now they've got to decide whether they're going to separate that. I think the names, most of them are candidates that were involved in the discussions. We talked about the managerial speed dating that Ratcliffe and Brailsford organised around Brailsford's birthday party, where he had Gareth Southgate, Graham Potter and Maurizio Pochettino all in the room at the same time, and gave themselves what I think was a very clever way to to chat to them informally and see how they acted in that context. Obviously, Pochettino is out of the running now because he's become United States national team coach. Southgate, Potter, both out of work, both interested in the job. There's Thomas Tuchel, was also spoken to by Manchester United, is also out of work. Max Allegri has been mentioned as a candidate. Again, unemployed at present, having stepped down at Juventus. Greatly experienced in European football. I think 3 or 4 years ago, if you talked about Allegri as being a potential replacement coach for Manchester United, that would have been well received, but he obviously had a very difficult run at Juventus in his second spell. I know he is interested in coaching in Premier League football, has been for a long time, so I don't think the problem would come from the Italian end. It's just whether you can present that as the right option for the supporters. I think you also got to look at whether they go for someone who is experienced from inside the Premier League. And maybe there are some unexpected candidates that might come to the fore. I'm thinking of someone, for example, like Marco Silva, who now has close to 200 Premier League games of experience and has obviously done a very strong job getting Fulham back into the Premier League and keeping them there quite comfortably, and currently has them 6th in the Premier League. I know Silva does not see Fulham as the final step in his career, and has been very keen, to the extent of turning down Champions League jobs in other countries at bigger clubs, because he sees himself moving to one of the top jobs in the Premier League as the next stage of his career. So perhaps that would be included in United's thinking. But I think it's more than a coach. I think if you look at the squad now, it's difficult to pick out players who are absolute elite quality. There are still a lot of bad signings in there, mostly driven by Ten Hag. Obviously, Antony is the prime example of that. But you look at what they've done this summer, and I think this is the big problem. I think this summer they had a window to change the direction of the squad. It required at least medium-term planning, and it required a clearance of players, which I think they achieved fairly well. Certainly sold players better than Manchester United did throughout the entire post-Sir Alex Ferguson era. But I'm not convinced by the players they brought in. And I think it was a mistake to allow Ten Hag to guide that process and to invest in Ten Hag in the sense of allowing him this crucial window where they had a little bit of PSR room to shift players out, bring new guys in to try and build a squad for the future, but allow him to decide to bring, for example, Matthias de Ligt, who I think we discussed this when the de Ligt deal was about to go through. De Ligt, I think, is not, for all his qualities as a defender, he is susceptible playing a high line, he's susceptible to pace, so I don't think he's a fit to the way Manchester United have identified as how they want to play. Joshua Zirkzee, again, I'll go back to Aurelio Capaldi, talking about how Zirkzee has been in Italy and asking him whether he thought he was a good choice for Manchester United. And his view was he's a good striker, but he's not an elite striker. And then you have the gamble in Lenny Yoro, which could prove to be a great bit of a gamble. But that's a long-term deal. They've given him a huge salary, an immense transfer fee for a player of his age, far beyond what any of the other European clubs were prepared to take on. And also they took on this risk of signing a player who had a partial, I understand, a partial fracture of his metatarsal, and was going to need surgery. Discussing some people who are familiar with the situation with Yoro before he moved, it was basically the view was his metatarsal was going to break at some point, and you could either immediately take the surgery before the metatarsal broke, or you could wait until it broke. Interestingly, their guidance on that is it doesn't actually make any difference in terms of recovery and long-term career prospects, which way you go, and it should be something you can repair. But knowing that problem was there, the numbers expressed to me was there was an 80% chance that it would break. Is again underlines the degree of gamble you put into the player, because you're signing someone with a fair prospect that he's not going to make it through his first season in good condition. Either that, or you decide to have surgery immediately, which doesn't look great when you're investing so much in a player, and make it difficult for that what is usually a very important first season bedding into English football. So honestly, I don't know who they go for, but I think the problem is more than the coach. I think they have driven themselves into a corner by the decision to retain Ten Hag, extend the contract, and allow him to shape a squad, which was always designed to be a squad for the long term, and which I think for most of the period in which any of us have had control of the football club, their thinking was Ten Hag isn't the person for the long term for us. So all in all, it doesn't bode well for the next set of decisions that Ineos take about the future of Manchester United, would be my view.
Yeah, it kind of looks like, to extend that gambling metaphor that you had with Lenny Oro, it looks like they've seen what card has come out on the river, and they have to decide whether to fold or go all in and continue with the bluff and see what happens there.
It's a good way of describing it, I think.
Yeah, you have to plan for the short, medium, and long term, and Manchester United is not an easy club to do any of that in, and it's the club with the most eyes on it in the world. So yeah, no matter what decision you make, in the eyes of many, it's going to be the wrong decision. But I suppose that's why these people are brought in, and that's why Ineos have brought in people with such experience and have the experience of making these difficult decisions before. But I think all the fans seem to want the same thing at the moment, and that seems to be a new man in the dugout. But like you said, is that going to really fix the problems that are there anyway?
I think there are some fans who are still supportive of Ten Hag. I think the majority have definitely turned against. But as you say, you bring these people in to make decisions, and they have to be brave in their decision making. But ultimately, if the results don't go along with the brave decision making, they don't look clever. And we're only 9 games into the season, so you can argue it's unfair to judge, but what we're seeing is very similar to what we saw last season. It's not like it's a completely new manager and a completely new squad, and they didn't know what the problems that required to be solved were going into this season. The patterns there are concerning, because it doesn't, I'm not going to say it doesn't look like it can get better. It can clearly get better. They can clearly perform above the level they're performing at the moment. But the target is to be competitive and start winning the Champions League and the Premier League again. They're so far away from that, so far away from it, that you would think this needs a change of direction, which needs a new coach and other elements, and they've set themselves back by not doing that earlier.
Yeah, they have. It seemed to be the wrong decision at the time, and I think a lot of people saw that it was the wrong decision, that they were basing the decision mainly on one game. If they had lost the FA Cup final, would that have been the end of Ten Hag? But he went and won the FA Cup final, and then they seem to be left with him now. It seems to be problem after problem in the back room for Manchester United, and it's a bit like what we're seeing over in Chelsea. There seems to be problem after problem there. It seems to be emerging because less than 30 months after buying the club, Todd Bowley and Behdad Eghbali are busy briefing against each other. So it doesn't seem like all is rosy in the Chelsea garden either. What happens next there?
This is a fascinating situation to see what happens next, because it's kind of unprecedented in many ways. Why? Because Chelsea was bought for a record sum, £2.5 billion, just over 2 years ago, summer of 2022, by Clearlake Capital, which is Baghdad Iqbali's company, and then a consortium of 3 other investors, Todd Bowley, his long-term business partner Mark Walter, and the Swiss billionaire Hans-Jörg Wyss. So they hold 38.5% of the shares, so roughly 13% of the shares each, and Clearlake have 62.5% of the shares. It's fallen apart pretty quickly, not just in terms of the football side, which has been well discussed. And look, the summation of that, I think, is relevant to what's going on here, which is they have built the most expensive squad ever in terms of transfer fee commitments, currently at 1.263 billion euros, surpassing what Abu Dhabi and Manchester City had done, and Manchester City comfortably retaining that tag for the best part of a decade of having the most expensive squad ever built. Over $1 billion of their own money spent on transfer fees to create that squad. They have removed just about every experienced player that they inherited from the squad. They have stripped out most of the backroom staff, gone through 2 different physical therapy teams to try and sort out injury issues that they kind of brought upon themselves. Chelsea, known for having one of the best medical departments in English football, when they took on the club, and removing those guys essentially because they wanted to see new people in all areas of the club. They wanted it to be their project. And I know there were conversations were had with various employees at Chelsea where they were told, we're moving you on. It's nothing to do about your quality. It's just we want our own people in. They've gone through 5 first-team coaches, and the result has been they've finished 12th and 6th in the Premier League, which are the club's 2 worst finishes in 24 years, dating back to Ken Bates' ownership of the club. Now, Iqbali and Todd Bowley in particular, because he was the face of the takeover. He was made chairman, he was made interim sports director for the first transfer window, have received huge criticism from supporters and from the media. They've basically made themselves a laughing stock of football because people cannot understand what the strategy is, why they've spent so much money, why they've gone through so many coaches, and why the performance has been so poor. I guess they will argue that they will have the last laugh on the strategy and the recruitment strategy, and that it will develop a team which will not only be successful in competition but make them money from trading. But what you see in these last few weeks is Iqbali and Bowley briefing against each other, and laying blame against each other for various decisions that were made during that process. What definitely happened was Bowley moved from the prominent role to one in which Iqbali took precedence in appointing sports directors, coaches, and in enacting transfer policy. That is for sure the change that happened behind the scene. Now that change behind the scene has turned into what you describe as a civil war. How does it resolve itself? I think this is interesting because you have got a man in Bowley who is far richer than Iqbali. Iqbali controls more capital through the Clearlake Investment Company, but that's other people and other institutions' money. To get either of them out of the club, which is what the brief has been, that Clearlake would like to buy Bowley out of his shares and remove him from the organisation, and the counter brief from Bowley's side is, well, that he wants to buy the club. They have to either put new money in themselves, or they have to find new investment partners to come on board with them. I think the problem for Clearlake here is the way in which the initial deal was structured, in that both sides have what's called drag and tag options, which means essentially if they bring a new investor in, they have to offer the current investor the option to buy at the same price. So if you're Clearlake and you want to get rid of Todd Bowley, one, you have to find someone who's prepared to buy Bowley's shares and potentially the shares of Walter and Vice for at least that very high valuation of 2.5 billion that they paid for Chelsea when capital was essentially free, and when valuations of companies around the globe had gone to unprecedented levels. I don't think there's anyone who's prepared to realistically value Chelsea Football Club at 2.5 billion pounds at the moment. But even if you bring that person in, even if you find a buyer, Bowley has the option to match that deal. He doesn't have to sell. He can say, okay, if you've got someone who wants to buy shares at that price, then I will offer to buy your shares at the same price. So Bowley can sit there and refuse to exit if that's what he chooses to do. And the brief from his side is not that he's trying to get out, is that he wants to take over the whole club and run it in the way that he thinks is correct. Now, if that's genuine and Bowley really does want to stay, you then have two potential outcomes. Clearlake back down and they sell to Bowley, or they sit being annoyed with each other, potentially carrying on blaming each other for things going wrong and not being able to move either party out, because Bowley does not have to sell. He has sufficient capital of his own that he can sit on this project, and he does have the capital to buy out Clearlake should they allow him to do so. So this isn't a simple process for Clearlake, and I think the way the initial deal was done and the way the money the two parties have under their control, I think it's essentially Bowley's decision as to whether he sits there and stays and waits for Clearlake to concede to him, or we sit in this stasis of neither side being happy with each other. So it's a civil war that I don't think bodes well for Chelsea, to be honest, because there's not an obvious conclusion unless one of the big egos facing off against each other decides to back down.
Yeah, it sounds a bit more like a Cold War perhaps than a civil war, because each team is probably using their own kind of proxy wars rather than coming out and doing anything significant, and they're trying to maybe undermine the opposition a little or win a bit here and make inroads there against the other. So yeah, it is one that we know that we'll continue to see played out unless someone makes a big statement.
It's not a good look, is it, to have the owners of the club briefing against each other in the media, and exposing each other's dirty laundry in order to put pressure on them, or because they're upset about their image. And I think this is the fundamental thing. These guys are super wealthy. They're very powerful. They have engaged in massive deals, particularly in the United States. They come to European football with the expectation that it's going to be easy and it's going to be a success. Just read out a little quote from Egbali. This is something he said in an investor summit, the Sportco's Invests in Sports Summit in October 2022. So not long after they bought the club, and he was on a panel being asked about running European football clubs. Why do you invest in European football clubs? How do you make the profit? And he said this: these things generally are not well managed. They're not optimized. Frankly, some of the US ownership, Fenway Group with Liverpool or Abu Dhabi, with Man City have done it well, but for the most part, these things haven't been optimised. We looked at it and we think European sports is probably 20 years behind US sports in terms of sophistication on the commercial side, sophistication on the data side. I had one super high level sporting director of the world's biggest top 3 club tell me when I asked about their approach to data and said, the data is my eyes. I pick my players on the eyes. He has 6 scouts, no data, and using some of the data points we know of, the good sports team in any league here, there are 20 to 30 data analysts and wide use of data. So he's talking about American sports there. So he was essentially saying European football is badly managed. It's badly managed because they don't use data well. They're not very good commercially. We're going to come over. We're going to apply techniques that we know from American sports work. And it's going to be a simple process of succeeding on the pitch and making lots of money out of it. Clearly that hasn't happened. But what he has done has put himself in the spotlight in a way he's never been before. Football has this influence way beyond its economic value, in that the vast majority of us love the sport. It's the most popular sport in the world. We follow the details. We are very quick to criticise. We're very quick to put pressure on owners and all the participants in the sport. And suddenly he's a public figure. And suddenly he's a public figure who is being belittled, who's having people make fun of him because his decisions, one, are out of check with anything that's happened in European football before, and two, they look stupid to the vast majority of not just European football spectators, but participants. The number of people in football I've spoken to within the game who are bemused by what Chelsea are doing is conversation after conversation after conversation. So Iqbali and Boli have had their reputation damaged by this, and it's clearly got to a point where they are fed up with the blame being attributed to their own names and are trying to say, no, it wasn't me, it was actually him. And if I can get him out of the club, I'll get it to work now. It's a civil war, and it's a mess.
It is, and depending on who wins, I'm not sure there is going to be a long-term solution, because like that quote says, and the way Bowley has acted, the way Iqbali has acted, what we've seen from both sides is that perhaps neither of them are suited for it anyway. It's not that, well, it's his fault, not my fault, or it's his fault, not my fault of the other side. I think it's a combination of faults here. What they're trying to do with Chelsea, bringing this American model, it doesn't really work. It's a totally different sport, obviously, but the nature of football, it doesn't have the same kind of levelling aspects that American sport does, that if you're the worst one year, well, you'll get to automatically sign the best player in the sport the following year. It doesn't work like that. And instead, they're trying to buy all these players for the future with lots of money. And then they don't really have anywhere to put these players, because you can only start 11 players. You can't really have a squad of 50 and keep everybody happy. You can't then sell players to your own clubs either. Yeah. We spoke about that on the podcast. So the solutions, they've created problems for themselves trying to be too clever about how football works, because perhaps these things work well in the NFL or MLB or NBA or whatever, but they don't work in the kind of openness that we have in European sports and football, where it's not just a closed one league. It's the entire global sport, and we're all well aware of it, and we can all see the mistakes. And it's obvious, like you said, you've spoken to many people, it's obvious for those people that this wasn't going to work. And I think looking forward, no matter what happens now with Chelsea, they're in a huge mess, and it's going to be perhaps impossible to solve, no matter who buys what or who ends up with which shares.
I've heard that from quite a few well-practiced observers. They don't think there's a solution. What's definitely the case is both Bowley and Iqbali have acted in ways that people I trust in football think are bizarre. So handing the club to one or the other unless they change their behaviour. I don't think that will solve the problem. And yeah, you're right to highlight this transfer market policy. There's a strategy there that if we try and corner the market in young talent, particularly young South American talent, we can build a team that can succeed in the Premier League and the Champions League, and two, make money on selling the players down the line. The two weaknesses in that are you have to build a squad, as you say, in an intelligent way. So there has to be a spine, there has to be development pathways, there has to be seniority, there has to be experience, there has to be the ability to find a place in the team. You've got to have the right feeling within the squad. You don't want players thinking, I've got no chance of playing, and causing trouble within the dressing room. So that squad building element has been lost. But also, if you're selling for profit, as Chelsea Football Club, there's probably only 10 clubs in the world you can sell to. And if you pump the price up, as they have done, in the initial buy stage of the young talent, then there's very, very few players you can actually make a profit on, because one, you don't have many buyers, and two, you've put all the value into the initial deal. So there's no profit to be made on the turnaround. So I think their economic analysis of the transfer market in football has been lacking. And that is probably the fundamental flaw with the strategy they've applied, and which has got them into this position where they're not quite doing it in public yet, but they're certainly doing it using public media, slanging and attacking each other.
Yeah, it's an absolute mess, and we've just we'll see now hear a bit more from both sides, and we'll get leaks and briefings and all that merry-go-round that keeps us entertained, at least, but maybe not necessarily the Chelsea fans entertained. But the Chelsea's big local rivals, on the other hand, the Arsenal have been doing splendidly well this season. There's been a new contract for Mikel Arteta, which Steve Kay reported on Football Transfers before it came out. So fair play Steve there. But Arteta, he's there for another few years. They're unbeaten in all competitions so far this season. They've had controversial red cards, but they've overcome that. He's wound up Pep Guardiola. But yet people seem to be criticising Mikel Arteta when he seems to be one of the few people that should be above criticism nearly at this stage.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's above criticism, but I find it strange that there is criticism of the way they are playing football, and some of the tactics he's used to get these results, given what's being expected of them, which is that there is only one more step, and the step is to surpass Manchester City, who won title after title after title, and who have set high watermarks for points needed to win the Premier League. And he's gone through what has been a very challenging start to the season, if you look at the fixtures they've had. And they've beaten Aston Villa away. Aston Villa, who had an excellent, although not entirely unexpected, victory over Bayern Munich last night to show their qualities. They've beaten Tottenham. They've beaten Paris Saint-Germain last night in the Champions League. A strong Paris Saint-Germain side, but one where Arsenal managed to get the goals at the right time and then played very well defensively to stop PSG from having many chances in the later stages of the game. And then that 2-2 draw at Manchester City with 10 men for 45 minutes. And again, he was super pragmatic. I think Pep Guardiola must have been having visions of the 2010 Champions League final, Champions League semi-final against Inter, as he watched that second half, and it looked like Arsenal were going to win 2-1 with 10 men. But those kind of defensive setups in scenarios where you are lacking a man or lacking your most creative midfielder, as he's been with Odegaard being injured since the last international break, for me, that's what good management is about. I'm far more impressed by Arteta being able to dispense with what's become the orthodoxy in the Premier League, that you have to play everything from the back, and you have to high press, and you have to pretend to be Guardiola light. Otherwise, you're not playing the right kind of football, even though Guardiola doesn't play that football anymore. Guardiola puts 4 centre-backs out pretty much every game these days and plays with a huge number 9 who he's prepared to put balls straight through to as and when is required. Arteta's applying the pragmatism, for me, that you need to apply if you're to go to that extra level and actually win things. And remember, he has only won one FA Cup in his 5 years at Arsenal, so he's yet to take that fundamental extra step of delivering proper, serious silverware. But to criticise him, I think, for playing long ball, playing defensive, for using the dark arts as he was criticised in the Manchester City game, I think just loses the context of what football always used to be about. Maybe it isn't about that anymore, but always used to be about you find a way to win the game. And it doesn't have to be playing this one style of football and being the best at playing that one style of football. It's adjusting the resources you have available to you to the specific context of the opponent and the specific context of the moment, and being able to produce results in all of them. And they now look a team that can do that. Very impressed by the way they operate at set pieces. They're extremely dangerous at set pieces, again against Paris Saint-Germain. That innovative wide free kick routine that confused Gianluigi Donnarumma, surprisingly brought back into the lineup by Luis Enrique when Safanov had 3 excellent games, his first 3 games for Paris Saint-Germain. And they look a team that's got pretty much all the components now. And I also quite like, as you mentioned, Arteta's ability to wind up Pep Guardiola after that Arsenal-Man City game, where the Man City players were complaining about the way in which the Arsenal players behaved. And it was just, I think it was just 2 sentences that Arteta used, which got Guardiola to go into this response about, you want a war, now we war, and you have to. Mikel has to be more clear about what he's saying. So Arteta's comment was, when asked about the City players criticising his footballers' approach to that match, he said, "No comment. I've been there before. I was there for 4 years. I have all the information, so I know, believe me." And that was enough for Guardiola in his next press conference to say, Mikel has to be more clear. Next time, Mikel has to be more clear. Exactly what does it mean, what he said? He was here for 4 years and we know exactly what happened here, because it can be related in all the process now with 155 charges. Interesting that Guardiola's talking about 155 Premier League charges rather than the 130 that he received. Maybe it's about that. He knows the information about that, maybe, or maybe he had something like, I don't know, because really next time I have to see more clearly exactly what happened. So yeah, I think that's one other element of having the full skill set for a Premier League manager is being able to wind up your direct opponent in press conferences, and Arteta seems to have added that to this season.
Yeah, is that the managerial dark arts to go to playing it dark arts on the pitch?
Indeed.
Yeah, I think the thing about Arteta, perhaps why his pragmatic approach is getting criticised, or it shouldn't be criticised, is that he obviously can see a plan B or a plan C. It's the sign of the good and the best managers are people who have different tactical plans and aren't kind of stuck to one specific tactical plan. We kind of even saw that from Pep Guardiola himself when he arrived at Bayern Munich, and he came with these ideas that he was going to bring a sort of Barcelona approach, but he had to kind of meld that with the Bayern approach themselves, and sometimes play kind of old school strikers like a Haaland, a Claudio Pizarro, or Mandzukic at the time at Bayern. So I think Arteta is developing as a manager, but he's shown that he now has the skills to operate in a variety of ways. Arsenal have signed very well. Their defence looks like probably the best in the Premier League. They seem to be the opposite of Manchester United, this team that is kind of a mirror image or formed in the Arteta identity, are playing exactly the way he wants, play in different ways the way he wants, depending on who's available or who the opposition is. And maybe that's the difference between him being an excellent manager and someone else like Ten Hag being under pressure.
He's definitely in a position of power now. That new contract in particular has reinforced his authority at the club, and might have some, I think, repercussions down the line in terms of the organisation of the club, what happens in future transfer markets. But look, for me, a manager his job is to make the best of the resources available to him. That doesn't mean we see commentators talking all the time about teams having an identity and a defined identity. I don't want to see teams with a defined identity. I want to see teams with multiple identities which can be applied to the right occasions in the game. Being able to change them during the game is a sign of a really, really good manager. It's when seeing when the opposition have caught you out tactically or have a particular advantage on the day, and seeing that acting on the sidelines to change the game can be the difference between finishing second and finishing top of the league. And he appears to be adding those elements to the skill set, because the job, I don't think, is to play a particular brand of football that's considered to be fashionable at the moment. The job is to win games. And if the job's to win games, then you have to be able to apply the tactics required at a given moment, and that's what he started to do.
So it sounds like you're saying Gareth Southgate is an amazing manager because he wins games and he adapts his tactics to win those games as he sees what's going on in the match.
If only Southgate had been able to do that. Southgate he's an interesting kind of counterexample. He's a super hard-working manager. Actually, the coaching side of it is done by his assistant. But the very detailed preparation for matches and different tactical plans for different games, but almost complete inability to change the tactics during the game to see what was going on, and being able to change rapidly in a match to solve it. Because some coaches, I think the majority of coaches actually, aren't able to see things quick enough from the sideline and have prepared their players in a way that they can implement a change rapidly and effectively on the pitch. So it's a rare skill, which I think few coaches have, and I think these days is being even less selected for than it was before, because there has been this fashion and desire from pretty much every club, not quite every club. Everton don't do it, but pretty much every club in English top tier and a big chunk of the championship teams to play a given style of football, high pressing, play from the back. And it's no coincidence that this last year and a half in particular, we've seen some absolutely absurd goals given away by teams trying to pass the ball out from the back, and defenders or goalkeepers handing the ball to the opposition 18 yards or sometimes closer from goal. Something you would have rarely seen in an entire season 20 years ago. Probably even 10 years ago, you'd seen it in an entire season. Now it happens every single weekend in the Premier League.
Yeah, football is definitely changing, and I suppose one of the managers that does have that ability was Unai Emery. You saw it against Bayern Munich that he was able to he wasn't just happy to sit for a draw at home against Bayern Munich, but he brought on attacking players and he exposed Bayern's weaknesses, and one of those weaknesses is Manuel Neuer being a mile out of his goal. Yeah, so It'll be interesting to see the kind of the counter examples that will emerge now when everybody starts, because everybody is playing the same way, how a clever manager will be able to kind of come up against that and bring us something fresh, because we all know kind of football approaches or ways of playing football are kind of cyclical, or they have certain lifespans. So we'll have to see what the answer to this is, and is Mikel Arteta the man to give us those answers?
Yeah, and look, just note here, when did Pep Guardiola win the Champions League? When he started playing big centre backs in the 4 defensive positions and put a big centre forward in that gave him that other option, that other the ability to switch and play different ways in games. So he moved away from his own dogmatism and that style of football that everyone is trying to implement, or almost everyone's trying to implement, and moved back towards something that would have been more familiar in the 1980s or 1990s, a very refined version of it with very high quality footballers as those big centre backs in those 4 positions, but also, adding that element of having the height and having the strength and having more than one way to attack. That's not coincidental.
Yeah, next, the only thing left then is to bring back the WM formation and see how that goes for. So now we come to one of our favourite parts of the show, hero and villain. Do you want to pick the hero this week, Duncan?
I say heroes this week are Brentford for their succession of goals in the first minute Premier League games, scoring after 23 seconds against Manchester City, 24 seconds against Tottenham, and 37 seconds against West Ham in the last 3 games. Something that no one has ever done before, and something that has been done very deliberately. As Thomas Frank, the coach, said after the West Ham game, it's not a coincidence. It's not like we just roll it back and kick it forward. We maybe roll it back and maybe kick it forward or maybe do something, but there's clear roles for everyone involved, and those roles involve knowing how the ball is going to be put forward, where it's going to be placed in the pitch, placing a number of players around the ball so that if Brentford didn't win the first ball, they win the second ball, and then are able to attack and get the ball into the opposition box quickly. It's another element of where Brentford have managed to find edges in the Premier League and stay in the division, is that they look at kickoffs as being another form of set piece and actively coach it, and you've got to applaud the fact that not only do they do that, they manage to implement it so successfully.
Yeah, I think Thomas Frank is an example of maybe that breath of fresh air that we need. He's gone back to not quite basics, but planning and using set pieces to their advantage. So he the next step maybe is a Rory Delap type to make more advantage of throw-ins for him.
Well, they did that a few seasons ago as well, didn't they? They worked. I think they were one of the first clubs to have a throw-in coach, but they. Currently, it's their set-piece coach, and they've had set-piece coaches for several years now, is Keith Andrews, who came in the summer to replace Bernardo Cueva, who was poached by Chelsea to be their specialist set-piece coach. And of course, Arsenal have a specialist set-piece coach who has, as I was saying earlier, has made a big contribution to them being where they are in the Premier League at present.
Yeah, it's something that you see at Leverkusen as well. They have the most set piece goals after the first 5 match days in Germany, with 7 goals from set pieces. So they are another club that Xabi Alonso is obviously a meticulous coach, and he's something that they're a team who does it and are capable of scoring indirect and direct free kicks, but also can see the advantage of scoring from corners or are able to capitalise on that advantage of scoring from corner. So I'm going to move on to my villain, and the villain of the week for me, because we haven't spoken about it since it started on the show, is UEFA for the updated Champions League layout, the format of the Champions League, because it's giving us very one-sided games. We had a 7-1, 5-0 and 4-0 victories this week after seeing Celtic rock up to a 6-1 win in the first match day. So yeah, it's given us not only these massive results and massive one-sided victories, but it's giving us a lack of jeopardy in some of the matches, because you look at Milan, who have lost both their games so far, and it doesn't really matter. They're not out. If you had lost your first 2 games in the Champions League last season, you might as well start packing your bags. The Europa League was the best you can hope for, but Milan aren't out. And you look at Brest, who are second at the table, but they've had 2 very easy games and have very difficult ones coming up. Being second in the overall group and starting off with 2 wins isn't going to guarantee you anything either. So I know this is the way to combat the Super League, and there's hoping for more excitement, but I think so many of these games, with so many more games, and we see Rodri complaining about it before he got injured for the season, that there's too many games. Now there's even more kind of pointless games in club football, because when we do get to the business end of it, there'll be so many teams with absolutely nothing to play for that you'll be wondering what's the point in this new format.
Yeah, it's an unnatural format for football. We've never seen anything like it in any club competition before. And to have it implemented in the best club competition there has ever been in world football. I want to see how the whole thing pans out, but I had reservations about it long before its introduction, when it was first mooted, which we expressed in this podcast. And you also, I think you have to look at the inequality of the draws. Some teams have got a relatively easy ride, and some have got pretty hard ride. So PSG, for example, have to play Arsenal, PSV, Atletico, Bayern, Red Bull Salzburg, who are a team you don't want to be facing in Champions League at any level, Manchester City, Stuttgart, and they started off the first game against Girona, playing their first game in the competition, which was not a tie you'd like either. So also the fact that it's drawn by computer, I think is problematic for supporters to have trust in these draws being done in a fair way. So there are many issues with it. I think I agree with your points, but let's see how it pans out and see how many redundant games we end up with, and whether we end up with a better competition overall. Because if we haven't, then what was the point of it?
Yeah, so wait and see. But at the moment, for me, it's a villain anyway. Just too many one-sided games this week and the last match day. So yeah, maybe the international break and a win for Ireland might cheer me up. I mightn't be as grumpy next time. You've been listening to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com. If you liked what you heard, please follow us on your favourite podcast platform and give us a rating or a review. Your support helps build a bigger audience and bring more news, analysis and insight. You can also follow our messages on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube @Transfers Podcast. Our Twitter address is @TransfersCast. Duncan is on Twitter and Instagram @Duncan Castles, and I'm @SwearI'mNotPaul. Our production is by Mark Hoffield, a Pro Podcast production, and our music is by Mark Hoffield and David L. Stay safe, be well, and thank you for listening.
Can't go. Where everyone's gonna go. Where everyone's gonna go. Where everyone's gonna go. Where everyone's gonna go.